In the dense, shadowy jungles of Vietnam, where heat and humidity clung to every soldier, an enemy lurked that could neither be seen nor anticipated. During the 1960s and 1970s, in the conflict that defined an era, the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese Army devised deadly traps designed to demoralize, maim, and kill the unsuspecting. While conventional weapons wreaked havoc on the battlefield, these ingenious and cruel traps represented an invisible enemy that stalked every step. These devices were much more than simple weapons. They were symbols of psychological warfare, where fear became a tool of control. As military historian John Keegan said, "Modern war is not just a physical fight, it is a battle for the enemy's mind." The traps of the Vietnam War embodied this invisible battle, forcing soldiers to fight not only an army, but also a terrain that could be lethal at any moment. What were these death devices, and how did they come to define a conflict that still resonates in collective memory? The Viet Cong. At the heart of the Vietnam War, the Viet Cong adopted a radically different approach to combat than the US and South Vietnamese forces. While the US Army had advanced technology, combat aviation, and a massive arsenal, the Viet Cong, composed of communist guerrillas, relied on a war of attrition, employing clever guerrilla tactics with limited resources. Despite their apparent disadvantage in terms of armament, the guerrillas understood that their real strength lay not in direct confrontations, but in their ability to strike unpredictably and demoralize the enemy through constant fear. By the late 1950s and throughout the 1960s, the Viet Cong refined methods that defied conventional warfare. Their ability to move and disappear in the terrain, especially in the dense jungles and rice fields, made them nearly invisible to US troops. Combined with a deep understanding of the local culture and support from the population, this allowed them to resist a much larger military power. As guerrilla warfare expert David Galula noted, the guerrilla's victory is not measured by the number of battles won, but by the ability to wear down the enemy until his morale breaks. One of their most effective methods was the use of an extensive network of underground tunnels. These tunnels, like the famous ones at Cu Chi, were more than mere hideouts. They served as shelters, hospitals, communication hubs, and even storage for the Viet Cong. In fact, it is estimated that the Cu Chi tunnel network alone spanned over 250 kilometers. Thanks to this secret infrastructure, the guerrillas could move undetected, launch surprise attacks, and then disappear, creating chaos that wore down the enemy physically and emotionally. However, one of the most terrifying aspects of the Viet Cong's guerrilla warfare was their use of deadly traps, which represented an invisible threat. These devices, made from simple yet effective materials like bamboo and metal, not only maimed and killed, but also instilled terror. The famous punji stakes, sharp and placed in camouflaged pits, were just the beginning. Every corner of the terrain could hide a trap, and every step in the jungle meant facing the unknown. Underground fortresses, the secrets of the Cu Chi tunnels. In the Vietnam War, the Cu Chi tunnels played a crucial role in the guerrilla tactics used by the Viet Cong. This vast network of tunnels, stretching over 250 kilometers, allowed the Vietnamese fighters to challenge the military superiority of US and South Vietnamese forces. Built between the 1940s and 1960s, the tunnels connected strategic areas, from the outskirts of Saigon to the Cambodian border, serving as a secret base for combat operations, supply movements, and most importantly, as shelters where the guerrillas could evade capture. Life underground was not easy. The tunnels, designed with incredible ingenuity, offered limited space, poor ventilation, and the constant threat of being discovered by enemy forces. However, these underground passageways not only served as an escape, but were equipped with essential facilities for the guerrillas to live and operate for long periods without having to surface. Makeshift bedrooms, rudimentary kitchens, meeting areas, and even underground hospitals were built into these tunnels, allowing the fighters to receive medical treatment and continue their activities. One of the most remarkable aspects of the Cu Chi tunnels was their complexity. They were organized into multiple levels, with secret entrances and exits designed to confuse enemy troops. Some of these entrances were camouflaged under local homes or disguised as termite mounds, while others submerged beneath rivers or rice fields, making them nearly impossible to detect. In addition to their intricate structure, the tunnels were protected by deadly traps, such as pits filled with punji stakes and wires connected to explosives, designed to eliminate or demoralize any intruder attempting to infiltrate. It was not until the early 1960s that US and South Vietnamese forces began to understand the magnitude of this underground network. Recognizing its strategic importance, intensive efforts were made to locate and destroy these tunnels, but due to their complexity and the guerrillas' adaptability, many of these underground fortresses remained effective throughout the conflict. Deadly bamboo, punji stakes. Punji stakes were one of the most feared weapons used by the Viet Cong during the Vietnam War, a brutal example of how simple, easily accessible materials became instruments of terror. These traps, made from sharp bamboo stakes buried in the ground and covered with leaves or dirt, were designed to inflict severe wounds and instill fear among enemy forces, a tactic that combined ingenuity with cruelty. The use of punji stakes was strategic, deployed on transit routes that US or South Vietnamese troops might use, such as jungle paths or riverbanks. They were also an integral part of the defense of the Cu Chi tunnels, deterring enemy soldiers from attempting to infiltrate the underground network. The trap was designed not only to damage but to leave deep physical and psychological scars. To increase the severity of the wounds, the tips of the stakes were often coated with lethal substances, from poisons derived from local plants to human and animal excrement. This added an extra layer of danger, as even a superficial wound could result in severe infections and complications that threatened the soldier's life. Although the use of punji stakes dates back to the First Indochina War, where Vietnamese guerrillas employed similar tactics against French colonial forces, it was during the Vietnam War that these traps reached their peak notoriety. The Viet Cong perfected their design, making them more effective and deadly. A harrowing account of the brutality of these traps comes from US Marine Frank Harbert, who, while on a nighttime jungle patrol, stepped on one of these traps and suffered devastating injuries. The experience not only marked his body, but left a deep psychological scar, a reminder of the lethal ingenuity of the enemy. Traps and landmines, the invisible arsenal of the Viet Cong. During the Vietnam War, traps and landmines became one of the most effective tools for the Viet Cong to counteract the military superiority of their enemies. They were not only physical weapons, but also psychological ones, designed to exploit the deepest fears of both American and South Vietnamese soldiers. These ingenious creations, ranging from modified grenades to the feared bouncing Betty mine, demoralized troops, slowed their advance and caused devastating damage both on the battlefield and to soldiers' morale. Among the most iconic weapons was the bouncing Betty mine, officially known as the S. This device, initially developed in Germany during World War II, was particularly lethal due to its ability to rise into the air before detonating, releasing shrapnel at a devastating height. The Viet Cong acquired these mines through captured enemy arsenals and covert support from international allies. Along with the bouncing Betty, they used improvised devices such as toe poppers, small mines designed to mutilate, and tripwire traps that exploded at the slightest contact. The Viet Cong's creativity wasn't limited to pre-existing mines. Ingenious traps like the grenade in a can demonstrated their ability to transform everyday objects into deadly weapons. This device consisted of a hand grenade secured with a rubber band inside an empty can. When a soldier stepped on the can or manipulated it, the pin was released, triggering an unexpected explosion. These traps were extremely difficult to detect, camouflaged among the foliage or hidden on well-traveled paths, making them even more dangerous. The impact of these tactics on American and South Vietnamese forces was devastating. Every step in the jungle was a deadly lottery, creating a constant psychological tension. As soldier Leonard Thompson recalled, walking on those trails was like walking on a tightrope. You never knew if the next step would be your last. This uncertainty not only weakened the troops' morale but also affected their performance, forcing them to advance with extreme caution and delaying their operations. To counter these invisible threats, American forces and their allies developed multiple strategies. The use of mine detectors and specialized equipment became common practice to clear paths before sending troops. Additionally, aerial reconnaissance missions were intensified to identify areas where traps were more likely to be found. Despite these efforts, the Viet Cong continued to adapt, refining their tactics to keep their enemies in a constant state of uncertainty. Net and fall traps, the deadly ingenuity of the Viet Cong. Net and fall traps were some of the most clever tactics used by the Viet Cong during the Vietnam War. These devices, seemingly simple, combined lethal effectiveness with a deep psychological impact. Designed not only to incapacitate enemy troops but also to instill constant fear, these traps created a battlefield full of uncertainty, where every step could be the last. Net traps, also known as man-catchers, were a devastating way to capture and neutralize enemy soldiers. These traps consisted of large camouflaged nets, strategically placed on the ground and secured with stakes. When a soldier walked over them, a hidden rope would tighten, activating the trap and lifting the enemy off the ground, leaving them suspended and vulnerable. The most terrifying aspect of these traps was not only the physical damage, but the sense of falling into an uncontrollable situation with no chance to escape. These traps were often combined with other weapons, such as punji stakes or tripwires, increasing the likelihood of severe injury. One incident that perfectly illustrates the lethality of these traps occurred in 1966 during Operation Attleboro in Tainan Province. U.S. Sergeant Michael O'Brien and his squad were surprised by a net trap. "Suddenly I found myself lifted in the air, hanging from a tree without knowing what had happened," O'Brien recalled. Fortunately, his comrades quickly freed him, but the event clearly demonstrated the imminent danger posed by Viet Cong traps. In addition to net traps, the Viet Cong also used fall traps, designed to make soldiers fall into hidden pits or structures. These traps, often camouflaged with leaves or branches, were implemented in areas of frequent transit, increasing uncertainty and danger. Soldiers never knew when they might fall into a trap, making the mission of advancing through hostile territory even more terrifying. The use of venomous creatures and sabotage. During the Vietnam War, the Viet Cong demonstrated mastery in psychological warfare, using not only physical traps but also venomous creatures and sabotage tactics to spread panic and destabilize the morale of enemy forces. With relentless creativity, the Viet Cong turned snakes, scorpions, and other dangerous animals into lethal weapons, applying their knowledge of the terrain and local fauna to create an environment of constant fear. Venomous snakes, such as cobras and vipers, were used strategically, placed in backpacks, hidden in traps, or even in areas where soldiers slept. The goal was to create psychological terror that undermined the troops' morale. The idea of being attacked by a venomous creature while resting in the jungle had a profound impact on soldiers, who feared both enemy gunfire and encounters with deadly animals. This form of psychological sabotage not only caused physical casualties, but also affected the mental state of the fighters. A particularly notable incident occurred in 1967, when Corporal John Harker, a U.S. Marine, was bitten by a venomous cobra while on patrol in Quang Thai Province. "I felt a sharp pain in my arm and saw the snake slide away from my sight. Within minutes, my entire arm went numb and I could barely move it," Harker recalled. Thanks to the quick intervention of his team, who applied a tourniquet and called for medical evacuation, Harker survived the attack. However, the event left a deep psychological scar, not just on him but also on his fellow soldiers. The paranoia of being bitten by a snake spread quickly among American and South Vietnamese troops, affecting their morale and increasing their sense of vulnerability. In addition to venomous creatures, the Viet Cong also implemented sabotage tactics to poison food and water supplies. Guerrillas used subtle methods, placing poison in water wells or in food meant for the soldiers. This type of sabotage not only caused physical harm, but also fostered a sense of mistrust. Soldiers could never be completely sure of the safety of their supplies, creating a constant feeling of paranoia and weakening their ability to operate effectively. In summary, the Viet Cong did not only fight on the battlefield with traditional weapons, but also exploited their natural surroundings to create an environment of terror and distrust. The tactics they used, such as employing venomous snakes and sabotaging supplies, demonstrated their ability to manipulate the psychology of the enemy, demoralizing the forces they faced. Wire traps, the silent terror. One of the deadliest and stealthiest tactics employed by the Viet Cong during the Vietnam War was the use of wire traps, a series of lethal devices that turned the dense jungles into a minefield filled with terror and death. By utilizing the simplicity of available materials and the jungle terrain, the Viet Cong set up traps like the spring trap and the sliding trap, which caused devastating injuries and created a constant atmosphere of fear and uncertainty. The spring traps, also known as whip traps, were among the most lethal and efficient. Built with taut wire and connected to a bent tree or bamboo stalk, these traps worked through a simple yet highly effective mechanism One end of the wire was fixed to the ground while the other was connected to a sharp object like a metal hook or spikes. When a soldier unknowingly stumbled upon the hidden wire, the mechanism quickly activated, releasing the sharp object with such force that it could pierce the flesh or even cause instant death. A notable incident involving a spring trap occurred in 1966 when Private James O'Neill was patrolling the jungles of Binh Duong province. He did not notice the wire until it was too late. I didn't see the wire until it was too late. Suddenly I felt an intense pain in my leg and looked down to see a metal hook deeply embedded in my calf, O'Neill recalled. Unable to walk due to the severity of the wound, O'Neill was evacuated by his comrades, but his story is just one of many that document the lethality of these traps. In addition to spring traps, the Viet Cong also used sliding traps and tripwires that in many cases not only caused physical harm, but also had a strong psychological impact. The constant threat of falling into a wire trap created a permanent state of anxiety among US and South Vietnamese troops who never knew whether their next step would be their last. Disarming the traps. As US and South Vietnamese forces faced the invisible threat of the Viet Cong's traps, they quickly realized they could not simply wait to become victims. The constant presence of these lethal devices led to the need for innovative and effective methods to counteract the hidden dangers that lurked in every corner of the jungle. Adaptation and creativity were crucial to saving lives and reducing the physical and psychological impact of the traps, which had already caused thousands of casualties. A key figure in the development of countermeasures was Captain Ernest "Ernie" Brace, a U.S. Army engineer who arrived in Vietnam in 1963. Witnessing the devastation caused by the traps, Brace was determined to find a solution. After closely studying captured devices, he dedicated himself to analyzing the engineering behind the Viet Cong's traps, understanding the mechanisms in order to devise ways to disarm them. Through his research and collaboration with local allies, he developed techniques that saved lives and helped mitigate the effects of these ingenious devices. One of the most important methods for countering the traps was training soldiers to identify visible signs of disruption in nature. Rather than acting impulsively, they were taught to recognize signs like displaced vegetation or disturbed soil, which indicated the presence of tripwires or hidden devices. Additionally, soldiers were instructed to approach suspicious areas with extreme caution and maintain constant communication among themselves, sharing any information about potential traps. Not only was training crucial, but specialized tools were also developed to assist in the disarming and neutralization of traps. For example, long-handled shovels and hooks were created to allow soldiers to manipulate the mechanisms without putting their lives in danger. These innovations, though simple, were vital for reducing mortality and injuries, enabling troops to move more safely in the hostile terrain. The trap disarming tactics, though effective, did not eliminate the constant fear. However, they helped restore confidence among the troops, providing methods to confront an invisible threat with the hope that they would not become victims of these devices. The psychological warfare of the Viet Cong, fueled by the traps, never lost its ability to terrorize, but the efforts to disarm and educate soldiers marked a turning point that allowed US and South Vietnamese forces to regain control of the situation, at least in terms of security. A historical tapestry of deception in warfare. Throughout history, deception has been a fundamental tool in military strategy, playing a crucial role in many decisive conflicts. While the traps and guerrilla warfare tactics of the Viet Cong in the Vietnam War stand out as a prominent example of these tactics, it is important to recognize that they were not the only ones to use subterfuge to achieve victory. From the Korean War to earlier conflicts, the art of deception has evolved, reflecting the changes in the nature of warfare itself. In the Korean War, 1950 to 1953, both North and South Korea, along with their allies, employed various deception tactics to outsmart their enemies. The North Korean forces used camouflage and concealed their artillery, burying it in underground bunkers or integrating it into the rugged terrain to surprise UN forces. Using hit-and-run tactics similar to the Viet Cong, the North Koreans managed to attack quickly and disappear into the hills and mountains of the Korean peninsula. On the other hand, South Korean and UN forces used misinformation to disorganize enemy troops, as demonstrated in the October 1950 Pole Charge operation. This deception plan managed to convince North Korean forces that a large-scale amphibious assault was imminent, diverting their resources and attention from the real points of conflict. Going further back in history, World War II saw a notable use of deception by both the Allies and the Axis powers. The most famous deception tactics of this war were employed in preparation for the D-Day invasion in 1944. The fictitious Army Group operation, a disinformation maneuver orchestrated by the Allies, led the Germans to believe that the invasion would take place at Pas-de-Calais rather than Normandy. By creating a fake army with false radios, inflatable tanks, and simulated movements, the Allies managed to deceive the German forces, diverting critical resources and contributing to the success of the D-Day landings. Throughout history, deception on the battlefield has been used not only as a psychological warfare tool, but also as a survival tactic. From hidden artillery in Korea to ghost armies in Europe, the lessons of the past show us that war is not only fought with weapons, but also with sharp minds and invisible strategies. In the case of Vietnam, the use of deception by the Viet Cong was not limited to physical traps like punji stakes or landmines. It also extended to the psychological warfare that sowed doubt and fear among US and South Vietnamese forces. History demonstrates that deception is as old as war itself, and its power to change the course of conflicts remains just as relevant today as it was in the jungles of Vietnam or the trenches of World War II. The study of these tactics reveals a deeper dimension of war, where perception and surprise can be as deadly as any bullet or explosive. The lasting impact of the traps. The traps deployed by the Viet Cong during the Vietnam War left a deep mark, not only on the soldiers who faced them, but also on the very landscape of the region. These traps, though rudimentary in many cases, proved to be astonishingly effective, not only in terms of physical damage to US and South Vietnamese forces, but also in their ability to demoralize combatants and alter traditional military strategies. As US and South Vietnamese forces ventured into the dense jungles and treacherous terrain of Vietnam, they quickly realized that the hidden traps set by the Viet Cong posed a constant and unpredictable threat. The anxiety of not knowing whether the next step might be fatal caused significant mental stress, turning every movement into a challenge. This constant fear eroded the morale of soldiers, contributing to deep psychological wear and general disenchantment with the war. Reports of anxiety disorders, insomnia, and post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, became common, exacerbated by the tension of facing an invisible enemy capable of turning the terrain into an imminent death trap. The omnipresent presence of these traps forced US and South Vietnamese forces to adapt, modifying their tactics to cope with the unpredictable nature of the conflict. Traditional military formations based on large deployments and mass attacks proved ineffective against the surprise and lethal attacks of guerrillas who utilized the geography and camouflage. This led to an increased reliance on small patrols, reconnaissance missions, and specialized units for trap deactivation, which in turn increased the vulnerability of soldiers to other types of deadly devices. The impact of these traps did not only affect soldiers during the conflict, but their consequences persist over time. Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos still bear the scars of war, with thousands of traps and landmines still buried beneath the soil, waiting to be triggered by unsuspecting civilians. It is estimated that millions of unexploded bombs, mines, and traps continue to cause deaths and injuries to innocent people, decades after the conflict's end. Efforts to clear and deactivate these deadly artifacts have been extensive, but the task remains monumental. The rural regions of Vietnam and Laos, especially, continue to struggle with the threat of landmines and wire traps, making it difficult to rehabilitate many lands for agriculture and settlement. This persistent threat is a grim reminder of how the horrors of war, despite its end, can linger for generations, both for survivors and the territories marked by violence. Moreover, the psychological legacy of the Viet Cong's traps not only affects the veterans who lived through the conflict, but also the new generations that grew up in a country marked by these invisible scars. The Vietnam War left a collective trauma reflected in the fear and distrust that still persists in some regions, where the shadow of the Viet Cong's traps remains a latent threat. In summary, the Viet Cong's traps were not just a tactical means of inflicting physical damage, but also played a crucial role in psychological warfare, demoralizing enemy forces, and forever altering the way war was waged on the ground. Their legacy persists both in collective memory and in the land itself, where the human and environmental cost is still evident. Echoes of fear. Testimonies of hidden traps. The Vietnam War, a conflict marked by its uncertainty and hostile environment, left deep scars on those who participated. The widespread use of traps by the Viet Cong further intensified the horror experienced by soldiers who never knew if the next step might be their last. Through the testimonies of veterans who lived through these hidden threats, we gain a better understanding of the psychological and physical impact these traps had on the lives of those who fought. One of the most striking accounts comes from John Thompson, a U.S. Army veteran who served in Vietnam between 1968 and 1969. He vividly recalls the day his platoon was sent to investigate a possible Viet Cong supply base in the jungle. As they moved carefully, one of his comrades accidentally triggered a wire, unleashing a hidden explosion. In that instant, a soldier was severely injured, and Thompson was left with the unforgettable memory of that day. "You never knew where they were, and it felt like they were everywhere. That was the scariest part of the war for me," he later commented. For him, the fear of the invisible and the unexpected became a constant that defined his experience in Vietnam. James Walker, another veteran who served on a reconnaissance patrol, shared his own nightmare. His mission was to move silently through the underbrush to gather information about enemy movements. However, on a fateful day, he felt a sudden tug on his leg, followed by sharp pain. A sharp bamboo stake, placed in a Viet Cong wire trap, had pierced his calf. The wound not only left physical scars, but also planted a deep fear of the invisible threats hiding in every corner of the jungle. "I never imagined something as simple as a wire could do so much damage," he recalled. This incident changed his perception of the war, leaving a lasting emotional mark. Patricia Johnson, a nurse who served in a field hospital during the war, was also a witness to the suffering caused by the traps. Although her role was not directly on the battlefield, the stories she heard from wounded soldiers, along with the terrible images she saw daily, left an indelible impression. On many occasions, soldiers arrived severely injured by punji stakes, wire traps, or improvised explosives, with wounds so horrific that the mere description of them instilled more fear than the wounds themselves. It was as if you could never escape them. Even in the hospital, the echo of the traps still haunted us, Johnson commented. These accounts not only reflect the immediate impact of the Viet Cong's traps, but also the psychological aftermath that persisted long after the soldiers returned home. The fear of the invisible and unpredictable, combined with the trauma of physical and emotional wounds, became a legacy that haunted many veterans for years, fueling anxiety disorders and post-traumatic stress. The Vietnam War, with its focus on guerrilla warfare, forever changed the way armies perceive and confront unconventional threats. The Viet Cong's traps, though rudimentary, were among the war's most effective tactics, as they not only caused casualties but also destroyed the spirit and morale of enemy forces. The war left wounds that could not be seen, a constant reminder of an enemy that fought with cunning, adapting to the terrain and exploiting every available resource. As we conclude our journey through the hidden dangers of the Vietnam War, it is impossible not to recognize the profound impact of the clever traps and tactics employed by the Viet Cong, as well as the bravery and resilience of the soldiers and support personnel who faced them. War, often seen as a clash of forces, was also a battle against the invisible fears lurking around every corner. As U.S. General William Westmoreland said, "War is fear cloaked in courage." The stories of those who served in this conflict stand as testaments to their courage, overcoming not only the physical threat but also the psychological anguish of an environment full of uncertainties. These experiences remind us that war, beyond its violence, is a constant challenge against the unknown.